Hello, Psych 101 students. Learning Objective 5 deals with descriptive methods. So, not surprisingly, descriptive methods describe what is happening. So, using a descriptive method provides a systematic and objective description of what is occurring. Uh, Systematic and objective are important adjectives here. You're not just observing to find out anything interesting. You're going in to an observational a descriptive study with, certain goals in mind. You're looking for certain things um, specifically. So you will often, you may go in with a checklist, for instance, of behaviors that you're specifically looking to observe or ask the person about. Um, Often descriptive methods are they kind of lead the way for some kind of new phenomena. So if you think about when COVID started, there was a ton of descriptive studies done because we just had to learn about it. Like, people weren't starting to run experiments right away. Like, they were just observing, like, what are the main symptoms? How long do they last? How long before somebody catches COVID do they show symptoms? What are the more minor symptoms? It just, how long is are they able to spread the virus? And so, like, a lot of studies were done just to understand what was happening, and so you just want to learn about a certain phenomenon. So once again, when there's something, if it's a particularly new kind of phenomenon, like COVID was, you do studies just to learn all you can about it, so you can describe, what the major symptoms are, how long they last, what percent of people get different symptoms, and things like that. There are three types of descriptive methods that we'll look at: case studies, observational studies, and self-reports. So case studies are kind of interesting. They A case study is where, when you study sometimes a single person or maybe a small number of people for an extended period of time. Um, so, all right, excuse me one moment. I need to pause. Okay, I'm back. Uh, anyway, so what I was saying was that you study one person or a small number of people for an extended period of time, and in a typical psychological study, we want lots of subjects. When I used to run, a lot of my studies would have actually hundreds of subjects at times. The more subjects you use, the more power your study has to show, an interesting or significant result. So why would we ever just study a single individual or a small group of people? Well, sometimes that's all there are. There are sometimes there's sometimes only one person with a certain condition or a certain brain injury, like this poor chap here that had this I don't know, we call that foil or whatever, go through part of his brain, and he couldn't form any new memories again, any extended memories. Um, this also happened to a subject named HM, one of the most studied case study subjects in psychology. HM had an operation in his late 20s where because he was suffering from seizures, and they took out a piece of his hippocampus before we knew what it was for. And after the surgery, he could never form a new memory. So you could talk to this guy for hours. You walk out of the room for 30 seconds to get a drink of water. You come back, and he won't remember you at all. And you could talk to him 300 days in a row, and you'll still have to introduce yourself on the next day. Like, there was no permanent memory. So, anyways, HM, I told you it happened in his late 20s. He lived a long life, and he had to live in care because you really can't survive in the world without with a 30-second memory, you'll never remember where you're heading or where you came from. Like you just can't survive. So he was studied for decades, and he was a very nice fellow who always consented, and because he didn't remember, being studied day after day after day, for years, and we actually found out a lot about how memory works by studying somebody where the memory failed. We learned, what the hippocampus was for. First of all, that you need it to form memories, but we also learned things like implicit versus explicit memory and things like this. But I'll talk about that in another module. Anyways, so sometimes there's only one, or there's a small number. There are certain disorders that affect less than a dozen people in the world at a time, and so you try to gather them up, that small number of people up to study it. So these studies are common with rare types of brain damage or rare mental illness. I already mentioned HM. A couple more examples are there was a woman named Sybil. There was a book about her. A movie was made about her. She had like over 20 different personalities, and so it was a very rare, severe case of of somebody having multiple personalities. So she was studied for a long time. Phineas Gage. This is from um, I don't know, over 100 years ago, I believe. He was a guy that had a railroad spike. One of those big long metal spikes. It's like I don't know, it's like 4 or 5 feet long or something, and it's kind of thick. Anyways, it was blasted. There was a charge that blasted it up through. It went first of all went through his cheek, but it went up through his skull, and so it took a part of his brain out. And anyways, he survived, but they studied him. They want to say, okay, he's missing a piece of his brain. Let's see what happens. It was a sad story. Apparently, he became an alcoholic. He became a very angry person. He lost his job. He lost his marriage, I think. I know. I heard that it was a lot of negative effects. It really changed who he was. But that kind of makes sense. You're missing a part of your brain. Okay. Anyways, so something rare is happening, and we want to learn about it. So case studies may suggest sometimes areas for further research. They give us glimpses into, like when we see that somebody has a part of the brain injured, we see like what deficits does it cause, and then we learn about, oh, that's what that part of the brain's for. Just like with HM, we learn that, oh, the hippocampus is needed to form memories. We never knew that before that case study. So you can actually find things about you can find out about how things normally work when you see them go wrong in somebody. Okay. The problems is that sometimes the results from a case study, particularly if it's a single individual, they can be misleading or anecdotal, and the results often don't generalize well. It may be that what this person shows will never show up exactly the same in any other person because they have a very unusual kind of brain injury or something. Okay, let's go on. That's a case study. The second type of descriptive study is called an observational study. It involves systematically assessing and coding observable behavior. And what we mean by coding is you determine categories ahead of time that you're watching for. I kind of mentioned this earlier. And you're looking for behaviors that fit into the categories that you're interested in. So let's say I'm doing an observational study with watching 5-year-old boys and girls in a playground. I may have some kind of hypothesis that at the age of 5, girls are more aggressive than boys, whatever. Let's just say that's my hypothesis. But I might, I can't write down everything that occurs. There's a bunch of kids all playing at once. I have a checklist. I have each child's name. I got certain actions I'm looking for. Like, so I see like Jimmy like kicks Billy. So I make a quick check mark in the tick column for Jimmy, and yeah, and then later Sally maybe hits Jason with her hand, and I've got a code for that. And so like I might have things like whether one kid yells at another. I might have things like pushing behavior. Like, so there'll be a certain number of behaviors that I have on my code sheet that where I can quickly make just little check marks, or I might have certain letters that I put um, to describe the action, like maybe a push is a P and a kick is a K, and so it's kind of like a shorthand way of gathering information quickly because there might be a lot happening. So you can't sit there and write out paragraphs about what's happening. Okay, to go on, two types of observations are with or without intervention. They also have other names. So without intervention is often called naturalistic observation. Naturalistic observation. That means that you're not interfering without intervention. So you're watching behavior in a real world setting. So if I was watching those 5-year-old kids, in a regular, I don't know, park playground, that would be naturalistic. I'm just sitting on a bench with my checklist, watching the play. They hardly even notice I'm there because there's some other adults sitting around. Um, it's got a high degree of relevance, obviously, with the real world because you're watching behavior happen in a real setting. But it's really difficult to draw cause and effect conclusions because it's not well controlled. Just think what's going to happen if this was an actual like park playground. Like all of a sudden, there's some 5-year-olds there, but then there's some 10-year-olds that come by and maybe some teenagers hang out. Maybe some of the parents go and interact with the kids, and there's no control over like what to draw conclusions from. Where I can say one thing caused another because there's too much happening and too many variables. And this is what the problem with naturalistic observation. It's good for gathering data, but often you may follow it up with what's called a intervention study with intervention study. This is also known as laboratory observation. It allows you to control the situation, so you can observe the behavior of your that you're interested in without outside interference. So if I was actually studying 5-year-olds and and their aggression levels in a playground, I would do a laboratory observation. You say laboratory, well, how do this is an outdoor playground. Well, a laboratory can be all it means is a controlled environment. There are many universities that do research that if they do child research, they have playgrounds in their, outside of their facilities. They are outdoors, but they're not open to the public. So I can choose only 5-year-olds. I don't want 6-year-olds or 8-year-olds or 10-year-olds, or I don't even want the parents there. The parents observe through glass windows. So the kids can still see them, but they can't interfere. So I would have cameras set up. Anyways, I can get exactly the number of subjects I want. Maybe I want 3 boys and 3 girls, so I have lots of control. So I can get more of the data that I'm interested in without other types of interference. Um, One thing about laboratory observation is sorry, I was walking away from the microphone because my dog needs to go downstairs. My wife's calling. Okay, anyways, so it's often used in experience. It's not just a descriptive type of research. I mean, particularly laboratory observations. You're much less likely to do an experiment in a naturalistic observation because you have no control. When we get to experiments, they depend on control. You'll see that. So a laboratory observation, yeah, we're seeing it in the descriptive section, but very much one of the main techniques for experiments. Okay, I'm going to. Actually, a couple more things. Sorry, I forgot. One of the disadvantages that we worry about is that there could be observer bias, and observer bias is coming, as it says here, is coming from the researcher. Imagine I'm a researcher. I'm an observer, for some research, watching these 5-year-olds for to see their aggression levels, and I know the hypothesis. It's I'm hoping or expecting that girls are more aggressive than boys. Well, you know what's going to happen at some point. Sally's going to go over and kind of wave her hand towards Billy's face. She doesn't actually hit him, but I look at that. It's kind of borderline. Was that aggressive or not? Or was she just kind of shooing him away? Like, and I think, yeah, you know what? It looked like she was actually trying to hit him. And I'm not trying to be dishonest in my observations. I'm trying to do a real objective study, but you know, for those borderline calls, most likely I'm going to see it the way I expect it to be. We we've found in many studies that we see things that we expect to see, or we see things that we want to see. This is why, just think of a sporting event, and there's a, you know, just kind of a disputable penalty, and you're sitting with your friend. He's rooting for one team, you're rooting for the other. He swears up and down that that wasn't a penalty, and you're swearing up and down, of course it was a penalty, and you're both trying to be honest, but to you it looks like a penalty because you kind of want it to be, and it influences your perception. He doesn't want it to be a penalty, he sees it differently. And this is what happens with observer bias. The solution, of course, is that if you're doing an observational study, the observers should not know the hypothesis. I need neutral observers, and they've been trained to watch for aggression, but they have no idea whether I think the boys are going to be aggressive or the girls, or what. They don't know what I'm looking for. All they know is how to make the check marks and, you know, do the observations. That is how you uh, take into account observer bias. The observer should not know the purpose of the study. Another problem is reactivity. So the observer bias, just to go back for 1 second, that's happening within the observer. Reactivity is happening within the subjects or the participants. And an example of reactivity is in this next slide, what's called the Hawthorne effect. And this comes from a workplace study. It was the name of the place was Hawthorne. I don't know, Hawthorne something or other, but these studies were conducted between 1924 and 1932, and they wanted to find out what kinds of variables affected the the workers' performance. These were all women, I believe, that worked there, and it was so they like manipulate some things. They in one part of the study they tried different levels of lighting, and um, and to see if it made a difference. Well, you know what? It turns out that in all the different lightings, they seem to be producing at a high level. And then they did another part of the study where they had pay incentives. Like, you know, if you produce this many pieces of whatever they were making, like, you know, you can make more money. And you know, the pay incentives similarly caused an increase in production, just like the lighting effects. In both cases, they saw the workers producing more. So they said, well, let's try another thing. They looked at manipulating break schedules. So, you know, like, you know, trying out different schedules of when people get breaks or how many breaks they get. You know what? The production was also high during the study. And what we learned from the Hawthorne effect was that the workers were working faster because not because of lighting or the pay incentives or the break schedules. They were working harder because they were being watched. And this is what's called the Hawthorne effect. In this example of reactivity, a change in behavior when you know you're being observed. I mean, just think of how a child behaves when their parents walk into the room. Before they walk into the room, they might be ready to punch, you know, the kid might be ready to punch his little sister, and then all of a sudden the parents come in and he's like a little angel. So this is reactivity. You change your behavior when somebody's watching you. Okay. The last type of descriptive method we'll talk about is self-reports. It consists of obtaining self-reports for research participants. And in a self-report, you can ask about all sorts of things. You might ask about a person's behaviors, certain behaviors you're interested in. You might have asked about their opinions, their beliefs, their current physical, mental, or emotional state. Um, these self-reports, although once again they're in the descriptive section, they often get used in correlational studies as well. I'll just put that out here before we get to correlational studies. But it is when we collect data like this, you can, if you collect a lot of data from each person, you can start checking for relationships between pairs of variables. Once again, I will get to correlations later, but this is a great way to gather data for correlation study as well as a descriptive study. Okay. If you one way to do correlational studies is to use questionnaires or surveys. They are so great in one way that you can get, as it says here, you can get a lot of data in a short time, especially since the internet came around. You can put a survey on the internet, get a ton of responses in a short period of time. You can send out surveys by email. Even in the past, before the internet, it was still considered a really quick and easy way to get a lot of data. You would mail the surveys. So, for the price of a stamp each, you would mail out 10,000 surveys all across the states, and you wouldn't get a lot of them back. You would be asking people to send, to give you their opinions or whatever you're asking about it. But you would get out of the 10,000, you might get half of them back or a quarter of them, but that's still a lot of data. Even if you got 10% back, if they're not 10,000, I got 1,000 back, I get, 1,000 subjects of data. Um, and once again, really cheap compared to paying subjects to come in, like, paying subjects $10, $20, whatever, to come in for an hour of the time. You're just putting a 50-cent stamp on. Okay. Um, Another advantage, that's one of the big advantages. Another is that besides being able to get a lot of data, as I actually already mentioned, they're easy and they're cheap. So they're cheap and they're easy because, like, once you make the first, you have this survey, then you just do a whole bunch of copying, or back in the day of mailing, or you put it on the internet. Like, there's not a lot of work after you have the initial survey. You just kind of put it out there and the data starts rolling in. It's not like you're chasing people down to participate, or having to contact people by phone. Like, it's so much easier than other methods. Um, Another advantage is you can, directly ask for a self-assessment of a person's internal state, which you can't really do in an observational study. Like, you can't observe a person's opinions or their beliefs or their emotions. How are you? You can't observe how not necessarily can you observe how somebody's feeling internally. Unless they're bawling their eyes out or laughing or something. But you can ask them, hey, give me a rating. Between 0 and 10, how happy are you now, or how sad are you, or what do you believe about this subject, or what's your opinion about this? So you're getting information from inside of them that you cannot directly observe just by asking them in your survey or your questionnaire or in an interview. That's the I haven't quite gotten there yet, but it's another type of self-report. Those questionnaires and the surveys are the ones that can gather the most data quickest and cheapest. But interviews have advantages as well. Obviously, they're going to take longer than just putting a survey on the internet, because you have to sit down for a period of time with each subject, ask them questions. So it is a lot more time consuming, but it has the advantage that you can change the flow of questions. I mean, once you have a survey set up that you've put on the internet or mailed out, I mean, you're stuck with those questions. In an interview, depending on somebody's answers, you might change your line of questioning. So you might all of a sudden find out something, hear an answer that no one else has given, and that's really interesting. So you do some follow-up questions that you might not have even thought of adding to the survey before. So you have a lot of flexibility within an interview that you don't have in a questionnaire or survey. Okay, disadvantages. This is true of questionnaires, surveys, or interviews. Self-report bias must be considered. Um, And self-report bias is when somebody, gives answers to make themselves look better. And it's very common. The more personal or intimate the question is, the more likely you are to get self-report bias. So if you ask somebody, I don't know, about their sexual partners, or you ask them about things like their drinking behavior, how many people do you think are truthful about how much they drink in a week? When a doctor asks them, people will tend, if they drink a lot, they'll tend to downplay it. Even people that drink a little will typically downplay it a little still. Or if you ask me how much they smoke, or or you ask people about their sexual preferences. This is why we've never had an accurate number exactly what percentage of the population are same sex attracted, because there would be so many people that would not be truthful because it was too intimate a question to ask. And so, or they would, they might have even been denying it from themselves. But this is the problem with these these types of self-reports, is that people, people want to give answers that either that they believe are expected from them or that make them look good. And I mentioned it was commonplace. Just to give an example, I have a doctor that I really like. This older gentleman. Been going for years, and I believe strongly that I will get the best treatment if I'm completely honest with him, and I try to be all the time. But there were some questions, and I didn't realize till after I left that I had I had done some self-report biasing. Like, he had asked me about certain behaviors. I'm not going to get into it here, but and I wanted to be honest, but when I left, I realized, oh, I wasn't quite honest about that, or I wasn't quite honest about that, because sometimes it's hard if if you do uh, whatever. By being, I'll just use those examples I mentioned before. Let's say smoking behavior or drinking behavior or drug use or whatever. If it's something like that, it's really hard to be perfectly honest. If you actually feel, oh, maybe I do this too much, or this behavior or that behavior. And so it is, the self-report bias can happen even when people are trying to be honest. The last point I'll make here is that, yeah, a second disadvantage is, some individuals just don't have good self-insight, and you could actually get more accurate data by asking other people about them. And then this is a problem sometimes. Like, there are, there are a lot of people that do know themselves well, but there's also a lot of people that they actually know themselves less well than people that are close to them. Uh, Especially in particular situations. Think about a narcissist. If you ever ask a narcissist if they're narcissistic, they will never say yes. I mean, it's part of their kind of grandiose thinking about themselves, is that they're superior in certain ways, and they're more important than others. They're not going to label themselves as narcissistic. But then let's say you go and ask their family members or their close friends, and they're all going, "Yeah, of course, Bob's a narcissist. Yeah, 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 he really is." And so this is one of the problems as well. Sometimes, people are trying to be accurate, but they just don't understand themselves well enough to give you accurate answers. Okay, so these were three types of descriptive methods. Remember, they're not only used in descriptive studies. And that'll do it for this learning objective.